In the spring of 1983, in an empty rehearsal room on the second floor of a Nashville studio building, Kenny Rogers sat alone with his guitar, waiting for someone who hadn't arrived yet. The room was small, with a single upright piano pushed against one wall, two folding chairs, a coat rack in the corner, and a window that let in a thin band of afternoon light. There was no audience, no producer, no engineer behind a glass wall. Just a guitar, a chair, and a song that did not yet have a shape. Kenny had been handed a demo a few days earlier, a song called Islands in the Stream, written by the Bee Gees, originally shaped with an R&B sound entirely different from anything he had recorded before. He had listened to it more than once, turning it over in his mind the way a person turns over an object they aren't sure they want to keep. It wasn't a bad song. It was a song that didn't yet belong to him, and he knew it. By 1983, Nashville itself was changing. The clean lines between country, pop, and R&B were beginning to blur, and artists who had spent their careers inside one world were being asked, gently but persistently, to step into another. Studios that had once been built around steel guitars and fiddles now had synthesizers in the corner and string arrangers on call. Record executives talked about crossover the way people once talked about weather, as something that was simply happening, whether anyone was ready for it or not. For an older generation of country performers, this shift could feel like an invitation, or it could feel like a threat, depending on the week, the song, and the mood of the radio stations that decided what got played. For Kenny Rogers, who had already crossed from folk to country to pop once before, with the first edition years behind him, this moment was something he understood better than most. He had been the new sound before. He had also been the sound that got left behind before. He knew both feelings, and he carried both of them into that small rehearsal room. He had spent the better part of a decade building a reputation as a steady, dependable voice, the kind of artist radio stations trusted, the kind of name that filled seats in Las Vegas showrooms without needing much explanation. A song like Islands in the Stream didn't fit neatly into that reputation. It asked something different of him, and he wasn't yet sure what that something was. He also knew that whatever happened in this room in the next hour would determine whether the song ever became his at all. The door opened, and Dolly Parton walked in, carrying nothing but a small notebook and a cup of coffee. She and Kenny had crossed paths before, friendly, warm, the kind of mutual respect that exists between two people who have spent their whole lives on stages, in studios, in rooms exactly like this one. But they had never sung together, not really, not in any way that mattered. "You ready to try this thing?" she asked, setting the coffee down on the edge of the piano. Kenny looked at her for a moment before answering. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's why we're here." It wasn't a joke, not entirely. By 1983, Kenny Rogers was one of the most successful entertainers in America. His voice was on the radio constantly, his face was on magazine covers, and his name filled arenas from Nashville to Las Vegas. But success, especially the kind that comes quickly and stays for a long time, carries its own quiet weight. Every new song is a small risk. Every duet is a question. Will this work? Or will it feel like two people standing in the same room, singing at each other instead of with each other? A misstep with a song like this, a song clearly built for a different sound, could be dismissed by fans as a step too far, a reach for something that didn't belong to him. And in an industry where image was currency, that kind of misstep could follow an artist for years. Dolly understood that weight better than almost anyone. By the early 1980s, she had spent years balancing her own image, the bright, larger-than-life persona the world expected, against the sharp, instinctive musician underneath it. She had already proven, again and again, that she could move between worlds without losing herself, stepping from country radio into film and back again, always recognizably herself, no matter the setting. But she also knew that every new pairing carried its own uncertainty. A duet wasn't just two voices on a track. It was two careers, two reputations, two audiences, all meeting in the same 3 minutes of music. If it didn't work, there would be no hiding it. Not from critics, not from fans, and not from each other. She didn't open her notebook. She didn't warm up with scales. She simply sat down across from Kenny, picked up the demo lyrics and said, "Let's just sing it through once, however it comes out." That single sentence, "however it comes out," was the quiet decision that shaped everything that followed. It wasn't a technical choice or a musical one in any formal sense. It was a decision to set aside expectation, to let the song be unfinished and imperfect before trying to make it polished. For two performers who had spent their entire adult lives being watched, evaluated, and measured against an image, that kind of permission to simply try something and see what happened was rarer than it might sound. Kenny began playing the opening chords on his guitar, slower than the demo, almost tentative. He sang the first line low, almost speaking it more than singing it, testing the words the way someone tests the temperature of water before stepping in. Dolly listened, her eyes on the page, waiting for her moment. When her voice came in, it didn't try to match his. It moved around it, lighter, brighter, finding the spaces between his phrases instead of competing with them. For a few seconds, the two voices seemed to be searching for each other, like two people walking toward one another in a dark room, neither quite sure of the other's exact position. And then, somewhere around the second verse, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no swell of music, no moment where either of them stopped and looked at the other in surprise. It was smaller than that, the kind of thing that might be easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Dolly's voice settled into a harmony that wrapped around Kenny's melody instead of running alongside it. Kenny, almost without thinking, adjusted his phrasing slightly, leaving just a little more space before each line, as if making room for her. Neither of them said anything about it. They simply kept singing. By the time they reached the chorus, the room, small as it was, with its folding chairs and its single window, felt different. The song that had arrived as a demo, a piece of paper with someone else's voice imagined onto it, was beginning to sound like something that belonged to the two people sitting in that room. When they finished the first full run-through, there was a pause. Kenny set his guitar down on his knee. Dolly looked up from the lyric sheet. "Well," she said, "that wasn't bad." Kenny laughed, a short, surprised laugh, the kind that comes when something has gone better than expected, and a person isn't quite ready to admit it yet. "No," he said, "it wasn't." They ran through it again, and then again. Each time, small things changed. A held note here, a softer landing there. A moment where Dolly let her voice drop just slightly so that Kenny's line could carry the weight of the phrase. By the fourth or fifth time through, they weren't rehearsing a demo anymore. They were rehearsing their song. There was no clock on the wall, but the light through the window had shifted from the high gold of early afternoon to something softer, longer. Neither of them mentioned the time. At one point, Dolly stopped mid-line, laughed at herself for losing the words, and started the verse over without missing a beat. Kenny adjusted his guitar tuning slightly between takes, listening more than playing, the way a person listens to a conversation they don't want to interrupt. Outside the window, the sounds of the city continued. Cars, voices, the ordinary noise of a Tuesday afternoon, completely unaware that something was quietly taking shape just above the street. What makes this afternoon worth remembering isn't that it was dramatic. It wasn't. No one was watching. No tape was rolling as far as anyone has ever confirmed. There was no audience to react, no producer to approve or reject what they were doing. It was just two voices in a small room working out, quietly, patiently, how to listen to each other. But that quiet work is exactly what audiences would hear months later, when Islands in the Stream was released and quickly became one of the biggest hits of both of their careers. It topped charts that rarely crossed paths, country charts and pop charts alike, and became one of those rare songs that seemed to belong everywhere at once. On country radio, on pop radio, at weddings, in living rooms, on long car rides across the country. For listeners, it didn't sound like a calculated crossover experiment. It sounded inevitable, as if these two voices had simply been waiting their whole lives for the right song to bring them together. Listeners who had grown up with Kenny Rogers' steady, warm baritone and Dolly Parton's bright, instantly recognizable voice heard something in the recording that felt effortless. Two old friends, trading lines back and forth as if they'd been singing together their whole lives. Radio hosts introduced it as though it had always existed. Fans hummed it without thinking about who wrote it, or where it came from, or how close it had come to sounding completely different. What those listeners couldn't hear was the empty rehearsal room. They couldn't hear the hesitation in Kenny's first line, or Dolly's choice not to rehearse the song the right way first, or the small adjustments that happened almost without either of them noticing. They couldn't hear the moment when two voices that had never quite found each other before suddenly did. For Kenny, the song became something more than a hit. It became proof to himself, if no one else, that an artist who had built a career on one kind of sound could still find new shapes for his voice, could still take a risk on something unfamiliar and have it become one of the most enduring recordings of his life. After Islands in the Stream, audiences no longer thought of him as a country artist who occasionally crossed over. He was simply an artist, one whose voice belonged wherever a good song needed it. The duet became a fixture of his live shows for the rest of his career, often performed with Dolly herself when their schedules allowed, and always met with the kind of recognition usually reserved for a song an audience has loved for a lifetime. The kind of song where, the moment the first notes play, an entire room seems to lean forward at once. For Dolly, it was another reminder of something she had always known, that the songs people remember most are rarely the ones that are forced into place. They're the ones where two people simply listen to each other and let the song tell them what it wants to be. It became one of the defining duets of her career as well, proof that her voice could sit beside another star's without ever disappearing into it. That two very different artists could meet in the middle of a song and both come away sounding more like themselves, not less. Years later, when people asked Kenny and Dolly about Islands in the Stream, the answers were usually short, almost modest. A song they liked, a demo that came their way, a session that went well. Few people, including many of their own fans, ever heard about the small rehearsal room, the folding chairs, the coffee cup on the piano, or the quiet sentence that started it all. But it was there, in that room, with no one watching, that the song found its voice. Not in a recording studio, not in front of a microphone, but in the space between two people who decided, almost without discussing it, to stop performing and simply sing. That afternoon never made the news. It was never part of an album credit, never mentioned in a liner note. And yet, in its own quiet way, it shaped one of the most recognizable sounds in American music. Two voices finding each other, one line at a time, in a room with two folding chairs and a window full of afternoon light. It's a small story, but it's the kind of story that, once you hear it, changes the way you listen to that song forever. Because somewhere underneath the polished recording millions of people still know by heart, there is still that small rehearsal room, two chairs, one guitar, and two people who weren't sure yet, but decided to find out together. And maybe that's why, decades later, the song still feels less like a performance and more like an invitation to sit quietly, listen closely, and let something unfold the way it's meant to.